remember when I was saying a couple months ago how the writers should do more to individualize the girls instead of shoving them into archetypal roles if they don't want people to complain about them being shoved into archetypal roles? Blossom's turn.
So to begin with, we have the girls marveling over the springtime, complete with a musical number from Blossom.
And this episode with one musical number is already better than the entirety of Once Upon a Townsville, even if it doesn't entirely make sense for Blossom to be the one breaking out into a musical number, but it does tie into the theming of the episode. Blossom's praising of springtime goes into the central conflict, as well as Buttercup's lamenting over the lack of snow days this year.
Anyway, the song gets cut off by the arrival of Jared, who is apparently Blossom's love interest.
And you know what I want to call out being done right in this episode? The fact that they don't really waste a whole lot of time explaining how Blossom and Jared like each other. They just kind of, give visual cues to note that. I think the best of these is when we sort of zoom in on Blossom's stomach and there's butterflies like dancing in there. And the song itself actually has lyrics to indicate that romantic feelings are the reason for these butterflies. It wasn't necessary, but it didn't really detract from anything either. I think I actually kind of laughed a little bit when I saw it. I'm not gonna lie. And yeah, it just flows a little bit better than what we've seen otherwise. And also, this is a much better animated episode than a bunch of other episodes that we've seen, which is nice. It's really nice to see that.
Anyway, Jared gives Blossom a check yes or no type of letter and asks her to answer tomorrow.
And from here, we kind of set up the central conflict of the episode after some heckling from Bubbles and Buttercup over the matter.
The short of it is that Blossom's uncertain about commitment.
Which is actually fair considering the girl's age and considering the fact that Blossom tends to skew higher immaturity than the other two girls, much like Bubbles tends to skew lower immaturity than the other two girls. It makes perfect sense for Blossom to very well understand the concept of love and whatnot, of romance, but not really understand it well enough to be able to separate dating from marriage. And it also makes sense for the other two to be the same way about it, but it makes sense for Blossom to be a bit more torn up about it.
There are a few issues I have with the pacing of this realization being a bit slow, but I feel like that's justified.
First, we got a couple of jokes thrown in there, one at the art style of the show, which is fine. It's all right. Do that a bit frequently, but whatever. And then there's the joke, where Bubbles repeats the word forever. I think she repeats it for a little bit too long, but it's fine. The one that really throws the pacing of this episode off the rails is actually the thing that I feel like is the most justified being there.
Blossom winds up having this dream, fantasizing about her being married to Jared and being successful, winds up dismissing it because it's unrealistic.
Which is a good subversive take on a scene like that. See, normally with that, like, the person would imagine their lives going to shit because of who they marry and, living in a trailer park with a bunch of kids, with like 50 kids, that type of thing. But that's normally something that teenagers would do. It's not something the little kids would do, so it would make sense for a little kid to not really think of it that way. Except Blossom's mature enough where she might think of it that way. But she doesn't. She thinks of it in more the sort of childlike fantasy of it all. And yeah, that makes perfect sense. And we get a display of Blossom's individual character traits a bit more in that she dismisses it because of it not being realistic. In fact, I would say that if she got the other dream, the one where she's miserable in a trailer park with 50 kids, I'd say that would also do the same thing. She would dismiss that too for being unrealistic. I like it. And like I said, it's weird that this is the one that I actually understand the most being here. And yeah, it's the one that throws off the pacing more than the other jokes that they put in here. It's really weird.
Anyway, Freak Snow Day, turns out Blossom won't have to answer Jared yet.
And I want to real quick talk about the small detail they put in with their cheeks in the cold. It's a nice small detail to have, and I guess you could say that it's less noticeable, thus they didn't bother animating it later. Although it may have been distracting to kind of have that throughout the episode. Then again, it may have just warmed up. I don't know.
I do like the sledding sequence for a number of reasons.
I mean, it's kind of a pleasant break from the main plot. And I'd like to note that, yes, I get onto shows for putting stuff that's unnecessary in there. When you're not cramming other stuff that needs to be done into a smaller space, it works well to have these little breaks. It's like a minute long. You can argue whether it should have been shortened. I don't think it should have. I think it was fine the way it was. But I think also what's worth noting is the soundtrack to this segment. The soundtrack for this was really good. I enjoyed it. The other thing about this is that we get a little bit of slapstick. It's just the girls having fun. Are the girls allowed to have fun every now and again? I think that's fine. And again, the show is well paced. This episode is well paced enough where they can get away with having a break like this. They kind of had a break at the beginning of the episode too with the musical number. But that also served a plot purpose. And this kind of does too. This shows something that we're going to see later, namely the hill that they're sledding on.
So Blossom gets reminded about Jared and that school's going to be back tomorrow, so she flies up into the atmosphere and uses her ice breath to extend the snow day.
Which, of course, is what creates the true conflict of this episode. Blossom is trying to avoid her problems. This doesn't seem like a problem that Blossom is the most likely to have, but it certainly doesn't seem like Blossom would be really immune to this sort of thing either. This doesn't seem very out of character for Blossom, especially considering the nature of the problem that she's trying to avoid and the fact that they're using something specific to Blossom, the ice breath, in order to solve it. Although, small note, this makes it look like her ice breath can control the weather. That's a bit weird, but whatever. Basically, the way they do it, she goes up into the atmosphere and then spreads her ice breath around. I don't know if that's like keeping everything cold, or if it's her manipulating the weather to keep the weather cold enough for the ice to not melt. But either way, and small note, I'm not sure how no one saw her fly up into the atmosphere like that, but you know, it's a whatever thing, and I like the direction they went with it.
30 days later, Yetis show up.
And Buttercup's I'll be honest, kind of racist about it.
Blossom seems to miss the spring along with the other girls until she gets reminded about Jared, then wants the snow to stay.
Thus continuing the narrative of her avoiding a difficult situation, or at least one that she thinks will be difficult.
They try to go sledding, and as it turns out, the Yetis have taken over the hill as a ski resort.
And as it turns out, they're just as racist as Buttercup.
Tiny people.
Okay, no, they're more racist. We're gonna go with more racist here.
We get a quick, heartfelt moment of self-realization that she kinda fucked up. That the other girls saw. Whoops!
And the episode kind of starts winding down from here, although I do like the way that they tie up things.
So this destructive Ice Yeti shows up, and Blossom tries to stop him with ice breath while being berated for not facing her problems.
And I'd like to note the symbolism of these two things. You see, she's using her ice breath to slow down the Yeti and not really be able to fully stop the Yeti, much like she's been doing with Jared. And this whole time, the girls are getting onto her for not directly facing her problems. As a matter of fact, it's Buttercup that's getting onto her for not directly facing her problems. The one of the girls who is the least likely to have an issue directly telling someone how they feel. So it's the right person getting onto the right person for the right things. It just works really well. And I would say that I don't think that this was intentional. I normally say that with this type of stuff when it goes this in depth. But yeah, considering how direct the parallels are between slowing down the Yeti and slowing down having to confront Jared, like slowing down those confrontations with the same exact power. Yeah, I'd say that the parallels are pretty direct, actually. I think it was intentional this time.
So Blossom finally defeats the Yeti. Then we find out neither Blossom nor Jared are ready for a relationship, and the episode closes as they walk off.
Okay, maybe it's because I tend to like a mix of action and slice of life a lot more than most fans of the original Powerpuff Girls do, but I really did enjoy this episode. I'm not going to say it was perfect. There's definitely things I can say that were bad about it. Most of the time, they knew exactly when to slow down and when to speed up. There were some very actively animated sequences that I wish there were more of in this particular show. But this episode had plenty of those sequences. Maybe not so much like action sequences, but they were definitely animated. And that's something that I certainly appreciate. I'm a bit concerned that maybe the budget went here instead of in places where it was much more needed. The entire episode of Frenemy, for example. But, it's whatever. If I had to nitpick this episode a little bit, I would get onto the plot for being a little bit predictable. But that being said, just because it's the plot I've seen a million times, that doesn't mean it can't be enjoyable when it's done right.